So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah Spencer and Dr. Kasaan Holmes. And we're both psychologists at the Kendall group in Friendship Heights. And both of us work primarily with, well, I guess you're more teens. I'm more child, but we work from anywhere from 6 to on up, yeah. And today we're really going to be focusing on talking about teen stress and anxiety, and obviously since I tend to work with younger kids, we can weave that in as well, depending on what your interests are. Anything else you want to add?
I think we just kind of wanted to survey the room a little bit and see who our audience is. So I'm wondering if you can raise your hand if you're a parent. Oh, okay.
Great. Most of the room.
Any teachers here? And any therapists, counselors?
And in terms of parents in the room, who has little kiddos, maybe in elementary school?
Middle school.
Middle school. Okay. What about parents of teens, high schoolers? Okay. So a little bit more of the teen group. Okay, great.
Can I ask you to speak up a little? Sorry.
Yes, yes. Yes, absolutely.
And maybe, is that back door open or shut?
Make sure.
We're going to shut it. I'm going to try to get it.
Okay.
Okay.
So maybe if it's shut, it'll drown out a little bit of the background noise.
Yeah, and just put your hand up if you can't hear us to remind us to project even more.
So we're hoping to kind of engage you guys in a little bit of dialogue, have it not be too formal. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to raise your hands and stop us. And we're happy to answer questions. Unless we get a little pressed for time, we might then, at a certain point, hold some questions for the end, if that's okay.
Yeah. So are there any specific ideas or thoughts that people have off the bat of things you really want to hear about to make sure that we weave that in? Any burning questions? Yes?
I just was hoping you'll address how how to help a child who's really hard on herself.
Yes, okay,
An
good.
overachiever kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of perfectionism, that type of kind of temperamental quality. Okay, absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about when, as a parent, to continue to encourage and push a child, and when to let back in terms of seeing where that stress and anxiety dial is.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you help a child tolerate stress and anxiety? Because that's part of life, and they have to deal with it, and it comes from academics, from social, from physical, from all of that. So how do you teach them to tolerate it?
Yeah.
So, how can you teach a kid to cope with stuff like maybe now that I'm 12, I'm at home alone, and sometimes they can get distracted and get really stressed when mom notices that.
Yeah.
So how to manage stress and cope with it?
I manage stress when mom finds out it's not about something.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So is it Max? Did I see your name tag right? So Max was asking sort of how, particularly when now that he's 12 and he might be home alone more, how to sort of manage stress that comes up, if he's feeling it and then mom kind of is reading it, how to sort of cope with that. Did I capture?
Kind of like if I have any homework to do and I go over the computer and start playing internet games.
And getting distracted. Yeah, so if he has homework to do and is getting distracted.
And then when I hear that mom's coming home after she calls me, I immediately start running, trying to get my homework done.
Yeah, so then the pressure to kind of get things done, how to sort of manage that stress. So we'll absolutely focus a lot on kind of coping strategies, on stress management strategies.
Mine sort of piggybacks the overachiever question of setting realistic goals.
Absolutely.
Because there's stuff they have to do. There's stuff they want to do. And then paying the price for overdoing it, what they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe just to preface by saying that, sometimes anxiety gets a bad rep, right? Like the idea here is that we want to, or people sometimes feel like we want to get rid of anxiety, we don't want anxiety, but anxiety can be really helpful, right? It's a motivating force. It's going to be present, right, in the lives of kids and teenagers and adults. And so part of what maybe we can talk to and get questions about if you're still wondering is how to have a healthy level of anxiety, right? Because certainly the goal is not to get rid of it, but to be able to manage it, to be able to notice when it's getting to be too much and it's becoming or beginning to interfere with functioning.
I wondered, in terms of behaviors, clues about when to say, okay, this child is having high anxiety and therefore acting, really outrageous versus just sort of being out of bounds in terms of like courtesy and basic manners.
Yeah.
So, sort of like what she said, when do you go under and say, okay, this is anxiety versus, hey, no.
Right.
You don't need that.
We'll
So-
absolutely talk about that.
Great questions. Luckily, our presentations covers most of them.
Hopefully,
so
but
hopefully
please
your questions
ask
should be
or stop
answered.
us.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the outline. So we'll talk about just what is stress today to get a sense of what that is and how that might impact anxiety, and talk a little bit about normative anxiety and emotional development. So Dr. Spencer was talking about anxiety as being helpful. So setting some stage in terms of what is normal and typical, something to not be alarmed about, and how to kind of identify that. Next, there are different ways that anxiety manifests. So we wanted to educate you all about that because some people aren't aware that anxiety can take many forms. So we'll talk a little bit about that so you can have a good sense of that. And then it sounds like a lot of you guys are looking for strategies. So strategies to manage anxiety, we'll talk about that. And then we'll also cover when outside professional help is needed. So what is stress? Stress is emotional strain or tension resulting from environmental demands. So when an environment places a demand on you and you experience tension or an emotional reaction to that. So it's really individualized and specific and subjective. So what might be stressful for one person is not stressful for another. So I'm sure as parents, your stress might be different than your teen's stress. So stress can have negative physical or emotional consequences. So I started out an undergraduate looking a bit more about the physiological responses of stress, increased heart rate, blood pressure, cardiovascular health. All of that is impacted or can be negatively impacted by stress. And then emotionally, anxiety is what we're going to focus on today, but stress can have, just overall can have a negative impact on psychological well-being. So stress can be pretty dangerous, and that's kind of a gloomy picture about stress. But again, it can be something that helps motivate you, and there's such things as good stress, positive stress in your life. It depends on how one perceives it and the ability a person has to cope with stress. So successful coping and resources mitigates the negative effects of stress and promotes well-being. So if you have the resources you need, if you have coping abilities, you can mitigate the negative impacts of stress in your life, including, I'm imagining that you guys are thinking a lot of academic stress that your teens are focusing on. That can be a positive thing for your kid. It doesn't have to negatively impact them. And
I was just going to say, one of the things that I find helpful as a visual, and I share this often with kids that I work with, is that both stress and anxiety we can think about as sort of a U-shaped, if you think about a graph of functioning and sort of stress level, it's very U-shaped, meaning that optimal functioning is usually when there's a little kind of moderate amount of stress or anxiety, right? We do best when there's kind of a moderate amount. If there's too little, we're not motivated and we may lack kind of the drive to get work done or to do what we need to do. If there's too much, our functioning really drops off. So the goal here is to be able to manage it so that we have a moderate amount. We know what we need to get done. We're motivated to get it done, but we're not falling on either extreme. And I'll often draw that out for kids because I think it helps to see that we're not trying to get rid of it. We're not trying to sort of, completely eliminate stress, but we're trying to help them manage it so that they're at sort of their optimal functioning.
So globally speaking, here's a list of some of the things that can be an internal stressor. So I said environmental, but your body is an environment as well. So it can include things that are kind of taking place internally for your teen or kiddo. So it could be a physical limitation that a child has. Learning challenges can be an internal stressor. Temperamental factors. So temperament is your predisposition to experiencing a certain emotion. And that's just something that your kids are hardwired and born with and don't really choose. So it can go back very early in infancy. So if you have a colicky baby or baby that's hard to soothe, that could be an underlying factor about their temperament. And then social skills deficit. So if you have a teen or kid who has some challenges with navigating the social world, that can be an internal stressor for that kid as well. So in regard to external stressors, these are just examples. There might be a bad fit between the child and environment. So one of the great things about McLean is that it specializes in giving an environment that's suitable for kids with certain learning challenges. And a really rigorous or rigid learning environment, that might not be a good fit for these types of kids. So that would be an example of maybe a bad fit. An unpredictable environment where kids can't predict certain patterns or can't predict that if they have a certain behavior that would lead to either a positive or a negative outcome. Bad or traumatic experiences, and expectations of performance by their parents and teachers can also definitely be a stressor.
I think that's a big thing in the Washington, D.C. area, right, in general, is how stressed kids can be about grades. And I know I didn't hear the whole presentation in the gym, but I caught the end of it, and the speaker was talking about how oftentimes parents are talking about failing, but failing is a B, right, or a B minus. And thinking about how to sort of manage placing expectations that are reasonable on kids, right? Because we want children to be learning, we want them to be working and putting forth their full effort. And yet the sort of stress of having to get A's can, for a lot of kids, be an unreasonable expectation, right? And so I often try to talk to parents about really emphasizing effort over grades, because truly that's what we want to see our kids engaging in, right? Is putting forth their full effort, doing what they can do, and yet not putting a huge amount of pressure about grades, because I think, again, that can lead to an excess of stress and anxiety for those kids that may not be kind of just academically A students, or that's really incredibly difficult for them.
So here's a balanced model of stressors and coping resources that is just kind of a model of a kid that's kind of healthy, has a healthy balance of stress going on in their life, and has a healthy amount of coping resources available to them. So the stressors might be a kid that is prepping for the SAT. Maybe they have a Latin exam coming up as well in the background. They probably have some typical peer conflicts going on. Maybe there's been some miscommunication with their best friend who's now upset with them. They have some stress about a first date. So that could be a positive source of stress, but it is a sense of pressure for that teen. Soccer game next weekend that they're excited about, but they're the goalie and there's a lot of pressure there. Sleep deprivation. I don't know how many of you guys have kids who are sleep deprived. So that's a stressor physically on their bodies and biologically speaking. College applications in the background, as well as some conflicts with parents. Let's say parents want them to apply to certain schools and that kid has a different idea about that. So that seems like a lot going on, and yet this kid is a pretty smart kid, so has some intelligence. They have a good foundation of study habits, so they already have a plan developed for their Latin exam. They've taken some test prep and some course on the SAT and are feeling pretty prepared for that. They're in soccer, so they exercise, which physiologically is a great stress reliever. They stay up late to finish their homework. So that's kind of a mixed bag. It helps them cope with balancing everything they have on their plate, and yet it does lead to the sleep deprivation. But they're not avoiding their homework, which may be a bigger issue. And we'll talk about that. They chat with friends when they're stressed out, or not even necessarily if they're stressed, but when they're feeling excited about the first date, or they have breaks from homework, so they're kind of socially in tune with their friends. They have supportive parents, even though there's conflict, they know their parents are there to support them. And they give themselves positive self-talk, so, okay, I can do this, SAT's coming up, and then I have my first date, pretty excited about that, I can get through this. So this is kind of a kid who's pretty balanced and coping well and has some stressors and has a lot of resources to deal with them. So now focusing on anxiety. Anxiety and stress are pretty close cousins. So they're pretty closely linked. It's a common manifestation of stress. So stress becomes anxiety when you anticipate threat. So again, Dr. Spencer talked about stress being adaptive and helpful. So anxiety is there to really, at the basic level, to keep us safe. So let's say fear is when you have a real threat or danger to your physical integrity in front of you. Fear is a very adaptive response. It helps you go into fight mode or flight mode to get out of a situation, protect yourself. Anxiety is the human's ability to anticipate, it's a dark alley, it's 8 o'clock at night, your hair is standing in the back of your neck. I'm not going to go down that alley. So that's very adaptive and helpful. It helps keep us out of danger. And we've evolved and adapted so that anxiety also functions to kind of motivate us. I have to study in order to pass this exam or do well on it. So you can anticipate that you may not do well unless you study. So that's why stressors and anxiety is very linked. So it can manifest in worry. So if I don't study, then I might fail. And there's also a very physiological component with anxiety. So your heart rate increases. You may have sweating. Your attention gets pretty focused and it kind of narrows. There are a lot of others. Maybe hot flashes happen for some people. So anxiety and your body are very physiologically linked. So again, I talked about why anxiety exists. It helps motivate us. It helps protect us. And anxiety and dysregulation occur when the demands for the environment can exceed the person's ability to cope. So unlike that healthy model, if there's a kid who doesn't have enough resources to cope, a lot of times anxiety shows you danger, danger, threat, do something, take action, and the kid doesn't have the resources to act on that, to keep themselves safe or motivated or prevent the failure of the exam. And sometimes when you're anxious, your senses can be overreactive. So we call that sensory overreactivity. So I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, feeling really stressed out and your body's kind of going a little bit haywire.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the physiological components, but one of the things that I think is really fascinating about anxiety is because of the physiological kind of symptoms that we feel when we're anxious, sometimes those precede the actual acknowledgement or awareness that we're anxious. And I think this is particularly true in kids and teens. So they may be reporting not feeling good, right? A lot of the somatic kind of symptoms, and not necessarily be saying, I'm worried. And so that's something when we talk about signs of anxiety that we can really be aware of as adults. Because the more that we recognize that potentially these physical signs could be indicative of something more emotional like anxiety, it gives us more information so that we can better assess what's going on with our kids, our students, whoever it is that we're interacting with, because we don't always have that cognitive awareness, but we feel, off physiologically.
So here's a different model of a teen who's a little bit out of balance here and is pretty anxious, stressed. So they have the SAT coming up. They're actually failing Latin. There's a bit of cyberbullying going on in their school, conflict with parents. They have a pretty heavy AP course load, sleep deprivation again. They've recently moved, and they have conflict with parents. So I don't know if you guys can identify with some of these stressors. And they're a smart kid. They have intelligence. They cope with homework by procrastinating, so putting things off into the very last minute. So they think, I don't want to deal with this right now until they have to deal with it. They are avoiding social activities because of the cyberbullying. They do have supportive parents, and they are coping also through having what we call perfectionistic standards. So I need to get the A. I can't make a mistake. I have to be the best, is how they're coping, and that's what's motivating and driving them. And this is kind of what's leading this teen to be off balance. So where does anxiety come from? We talked a little bit about temperament. Some kids are just hardwired that way. That's the way suitcase that was packed with them when they came into this world. So they can be a predisposition and a vulnerability to emotional disturbance, but it's not necessarily a cause of a mental disorder. So your type A personality has a temperament that's probably in line with anxious styles. And, those people who can master that tend to make good use of that resource. It motivates them. They're pretty driven.
We had one question.
Oh.
I apologize. The
Yeah.
previous slide. Can you go back to that for a second?
Sure.
I'm a little confused about the message that you're displaying here with the unbalanced system there. You have a lot of coping mechanisms there, but it seems as though, are you trying to indicate that there are inadequate levels of coping mechanisms, or what is it that you're trying to do?
Sure. I'm trying to indicate that that teen does not have enough coping resources to counterbalance everything they have going on there. So procrastination is a way of avoiding something that's provoking anxiety, and I'm going to go into that in detail so you'll see why procrastination is not a great strategy. Avoiding social activities is also a way to avoid anxiety-provoking situations. So those are types of coping strategies that can perpetuate anxiety.
Right. So when I look at the coping mechanisms that you have there, I see some of them as possibly being positive, and some of them actually adding to the stressors.
Yes,
Exactly.
perfect.
Okay.
So that I think that's pretty normative in the teens we work with and kids we work with, that there are some positive resources available, and the negative ones are counterbalancing it, or there's just not enough there.
Okay.
So stress also has a really interesting impact on your brain. So 3 areas there are your amygdala, so that's where you have your emotions. Specifically, your fear is located there in your brain. That is where the fight or flight response is activated. Hippocampus is where you have memory. So when your teen is trying to recall and study information, that's housed in your hippocampus. And in your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet in your kids, but they have some ability there. So that's your higher order brain functioning, like executive functioning, planning, organizing, processing more abstract information. That doesn't fully develop until age 25. So your kids aren't fully firing in that area, but that's what they need to kind of study and plan and manage everything they have going on in their lives. And they're just kind of developing this area in their brain. When your amygdala is firing and you're really stressed and you're anxious, that is, your body's going into survival mode. And so even if it's misfiring, where maybe they are just worrying about something, that amygdala fires and it's preparing your body for fight or flight, for a real danger. And that is actually impairing your prefrontal cortex. So your kids have limited ability there to begin with when compared to adults, and then that prefrontal cortex area is shutting down. So think about if you have a kid who has a lot of test anxiety, when their body is in fight or flight mode, what's going to happen to their prefrontal cortex? It's not firing. So they're not able to fully function. So that's kind of one of the things that goes on when you have a kid who is pretty anxious, and why maybe their test scores aren't reflecting their abilities. Or if you have a kid who's pretty stressed or anxious and you're like, you're not making sense, and you're trying to talk sense to them, that's why they can't fully process. Yeah?
How does that relate with insomnia? Like, I think my daughter is, her amygdala must be, going whack, and then she's not sleeping. Does that, and then of course I'm saying try this, or this. No. She wants to be the one in charge, and that's probably because her cortex is not fully functioning.
Yeah, and because teens are, one of the driving forces is autonomy and independence, right? So being told what to do, we get a lot of pushback from that. It's interesting, sleep, it's so hard because we know teens need so much sleep. And yet, if they're anxious, we also know that the pattern of rumination and worry seems to be really heightened at night as they're kind of letting down, right, from the day. Because they might have some really great coping mechanisms to get through school and do what they need to do. And then as they start to sort of let down, it's when there's a lot of review of what happened during the day and why did I do this or that or what's tomorrow. And so it can be a huge interference with sleep, particularly if they're up late doing homework, right? Because that's stressful. And as we all probably know, we can't just instantly fall asleep after coming home from work or doing kind of a pretty intense cognitive activity. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the relaxation and kind of mindfulness strategies that might be helpful in decreasing that intensity of worry that seems to occur for so many teens at night.
So now we'll kind of shift just to give you a little education around anxiety disorders and normative anxiety before we go into more of the strategy-based approaches.
Yeah. So when we think about normal anxiety, right, which we all have, think again about that kind of inverse U-shaped graph that I was illustrating before. That a healthy level of anxiety motivates us, right? It makes a little bit of worry and concern. It drives us to study, to prepare, to feel kind of comfortable in whatever challenge we're going to face. However, if it becomes more persistent and more significant, it begins to cause a lot of avoidance. And that's really the sign that anxiety has gotten to a level that the teen or student can no longer manage effectively. Our urge, our kind of evolutionary or biological urge with anxiety is to run, is to avoid, right? And it's really the avoidance that begins to morph from normal anxiety into more clinically significant or problematic anxiety. The other element here that's really important is how persistent or excessive is the worry. We all worry, right? But many of us are able to kind of turn it off to some degree or kind of go, okay, I've got to put this aside, right? For right now, I need to be able to do this, this, and this. For those students where anxiety becomes problematic, they can't turn it off, right? It's constant, and it may begin to interfere with things like sleep or their ability to focus and get their work done. And then obviously anxiety is hugely distressing. And as I talked about earlier, one of the most fascinating parts of it is that it is so physiological. So oftentimes kids will start to report frequent headaches, right, or stomach aches, or having trouble concentrating. It can look like a lot of other things, and yet as we begin to really assess it, it might be clear that they're avoiding and that they're having a lot of worries about whatever it is that's going on in their lives. So in terms of warning signs, I've mentioned already the somatic symptoms, right, headaches, stomach aches, muscle tension. I've had a lot of children and teens that I've worked with talk about just pain, right? Like their muscles ache or their shoulders are, their back is hurting. And it comes to my awareness as we're talking that it's because they're so tense, right? And that muscle tension can lead to a lot of pain if we're holding that, hours upon hours during the day.
I'm very curious about
Yeah.
Can some teens stretch? Can some teens stress itch? Kind of, they get really itchy when they're stressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? Because we're having a lot of neurotransmitters and hormones kind of released in our body as we're anxious, right? We're having that fight or flight response. So we can feel it lots of different ways, but it could be, absolutely. The other thing that I want to bring up is that oftentimes we think of anxiety as this persistent worry and people saying, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. But oftentimes students, teens and also children aren't expressing it in that way. We more see it in terms of mood changes, that they're more irritable, that they have kind of a shorter rope, right? Their frustration tolerance is decreasing. And so sometimes it's actually that shift in mood and irritability that might be a warning sign for anxiety. It could be other things too, obviously, but puts us on edge, right? And if we're feeling on edge and we're feeling anxious, we're not going to be able to tolerate the same amount of frustration or challenge. And then, of course, you know, sometimes we'll even see oppositional behavior. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to school, right? I'm not taking that exam. And that can be incredibly challenging, and yet that is avoidance at its extreme, right? That pushback. And so sometimes it can look more oppositional as well. And then, of course, we might begin to see academic challenges with missed work or decreasing grades over time. Any questions about these warning signs or other warning signs that you're curious about that I haven't touched on? Yeah.
The connection, back to that brain graph.
Yeah.
I see my child freezing in the moment.
Yes.
And it's persistent that it's episodic based on the teacher calling on him.
Yes.
Or a social situation where a friend would expect him to respond.
Absolutely.
He freezes, then he sort of wants to stay home.
Yes, yes. Oftentimes kids will report like their mind going blank, right? Because they get really paralyzed in the moment by the anxiety. And of course that just leads them to want to get out of the situation. And so part of it is learning how to manage that, because the great thing with anxiety, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about treatments, is that it peaks and then it comes down. It doesn't stay at that heightened level. So if we can ride it out, our thoughts will come back, right? We're not going to stay frozen. But the problem is that we get out of the situation and then that heightens our anxiety, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But absolutely, freezing is a huge sort of behavior that occurs or feeling that occurs during tests, in social situations. You know, sometimes teens or students are so terrified of being asked a question in class because they know that their mind is going to go blank with that anxiety.
Also impulsivity. I see a
Yeah.
lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of my daughters, the anxiety leads to massive impulsivity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I didn't jump ahead on your slide, did I? No, good, okay. Just making sure. So a lot of these we've talked about already, but in terms of common characteristics of anxious students, you know, this can be kind of the shutting down, wanting to be in control, right? So oftentimes anxiety, it's distressing to feel. And so sometimes kids will they don't want to really talk about that. They want to just do what they need to do and sort of feel like they at least have some control over their activities, since they don't have the control over their physiology and sort of their emotions. And so we can get more of that, both impulsivity but also pushback of, I don't want to try that, right? I don't want to use that strategy. Because I think, again, it makes them vulnerable. And so that can be really difficult, particularly if they're not totally aware of what emotion they're having. They just know it's generally they're not feeling good. We can see that sort of desire for control. You know, perfectionism, there's been such kind of hot research and books in the media on perfectionism, right? I think we're recognizing it now as really I think temperamental trait, although certainly there's elements that can be learned as well, given sort of the home environment or school environment, but can be a predisposition to anxiety, right? If we're perfectionistic, we're if we fail or we don't feel like we do as good of a job as we want, that can lead to a really heightened emotional reaction. So those perfectionism and anxiety can really go hand in hand, and it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, right, which came first, but we know that they can really feed each other. Low frustration tolerance, as we've talked about, kind of that irritability, not being able to handle demands that maybe they used to be able to handle. Sometimes we see fidgeting and inattention, right? And it can kind of look like ADHD, except it really isn't, right? It really is more that they're so anxious that they're getting easily distracted by other students turning in their exams before they're finished, right? And getting totally kind of wrapped up in external stimulation and losing focus. So that's often something that can look like one thing, but really be more indicative of anxiety. You know, fidgeting, nail biting, you know, all those sort of motor movements can also be manifestations of anxiety. We talked about freezing. And then obviously for many kids, they are expressing worries, right? I'm worried I'm going to fail. I'm worried I'm going to make a mistake. I'm worried I'm going to embarrass myself, right? Embarrassment is often something that for kids with social anxiety, they're talking about a lot. They're not necessarily saying they're afraid of being around others, but they're saying, I'm going to embarrass myself, right? They're going to judge me or think I'm weird. And so that often can be expressed when there's that sense of social anxiety. Anything to add?
I also hear them say, it just doesn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I can hear that a lot. And you say, does it make you anxious? We'll say, no, I'm just not comfortable.
Just not comfortable.
And I just take them at that word.
Yeah. The language aspect's really interesting because we all have different verbiage for how, or words for how we describe our emotions. And it can be trickier with kids and teenagers because they may not have this sort of language to really describe the complexity of their emotions. So words like uncomfortable or, you know, I just don't like it, or, you know, I'm not feeling good, oftentimes those can be how they're describing that kind of complex emotional distress that they're feeling. So we've talked about this. Yeah, I think, again, the only thing I want to point out is that we really think about anxiety as on sort of a spectrum, right? That we all have some level of anxiety, and that really it isn't that you have it or you don't, but it's how significant it is and how much impairment it is causing in the individual's functioning. So I wanted to just briefly mention the most common anxiety disorders that we diagnose, and that that if they are present, we really want to treat. Because again, the wonderful news about anxiety is that it's highly treatable, and that's wonderful, right? Not to take away from how distressing it can be and how impairing it can be, but that we've got really great treatments. So I just wanted to touch on a few of the more common anxiety disorders that we see. I won't go through all the criteria to bore you, but just to kind of highlight. So panic disorder is when an individual is having frequent and unexpected panic attacks. And this is important, and they begin to be terrified about having future panic attacks. So simply just having a panic attack doesn't mean you have panic disorder. It really is about the persistent fear of having more, and that as a result of that persistent fear, you're avoiding lots of different activities. But you can absolutely be anxious and have panic attacks and not necessarily have panic disorder. Yeah?
Clarify what you mean by having more. So are you saying of having more environmental stressors, or are you just talking about more actual panic attacks?
Panic attacks. Yep, exactly. Are people familiar with what a panic attack is? No? Okay, so a panic attack is an intense physiological response that occurs very, very rapidly, usually peaks within 10 minutes. And along with that comes a lot of physiological responses, such as increased heart rate, sweating, shakiness, dizziness, nausea. It can be really terrifying, right? And it's actually one of the main reasons that people go to the emergency room, right? And then they're told this is actually just a panic attack, but it's that intense for many people. There's also a lot of cognitive components, a sense of doom or kind of dying, like you feel like you're really dying, right? And you have a sense that something bad is going to happen. But it's incredibly intense. Sometimes it's triggered by something like, you know, public speaking or seeing something that you're really afraid of. Sometimes it's completely out of the blue. And that can be the scariest for children and teenagers because they don't know what's happening to them and why it's happening. Again, it usually peaks within about 10 minutes and decreases, although people often say they feel off afterward. It just kind of, because if you imagine all of the cortisol and sort of, you know, biological changes that's happening with your nervous system, there's going to have some ramifications afterward. Yes?
Is that related to tantrums that younger children have sometimes?
It's an interesting question. I mean, it could be, right? I mean, it could be. I don't want to say that every child that has a tantrum necessarily had a panic attack, but it might be if that child is perceiving a lot of physiological changes and then gets really distressed. It could be. Usually tantrums are more triggered by something, you know, being taken away or whatever else. But if it's a completely out of the blue tantrum, it might absolutely be anxiety or panic. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
And does one panic attack potentially lead to another because of?
It does, because they're scary, right? And so oftentimes people that have had panic attacks tend to be very aware of their internal physiology. It's really interesting. One of the main predisposing factors for panic disorder is individuals that are more in tune with things like their heart rate and breathing. So oftentimes they're just more aware of what their body is doing moment to moment, and that makes them more disposed to having a panic attack because then, you know, if you run up the stairs and your heart rate's going a little bit faster and you've had a panic attack, you may begin to interpret that as the beginning of another panic attack. And of course, what's that worry going to do? Make us more heightened to have a panic attack, right? Because we become so focused on it. In terms of generalized anxiety disorder, this is really characterized by persistent and pervasive fears spanning a lot of different areas. So it's not just a fear of one thing like social interactions, but it's worrying about grades, academics, friendships, you know, health of your family, your own health, right? So it can be a lot of worries spanning a lot of different areas. Along with GAD, there's a lot of physiological tension as well. Not necessarily full-blown panic attacks, but just a lot of muscle tension, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, because again, there's so much worry going on internally for those individuals. Social anxiety disorder is when the fear is really focused on evaluation by others, right? So this could be triggered by having a teacher ask you a question in class. It could be based on social interactions with peers, public speaking. So oftentimes when we see social anxiety in teenagers, they're avoiding interacting with, you know, social groups. They're not going to parties or kind of bigger social functionings, or they are terrified of making presentations or being put on the spot in class. The real key with social anxiety is that there is a fear of negative evaluation from others. Specific phobia is when, you know, again, there's one situation or object that is triggering the anxiety. This could be anything from, you know, fear of spiders to fear of flying, something that's much more specific. But again, all of these are leading to heightened levels of distress when they're faced with whatever is anxiety provoking, and many can include panic attacks, as we've talked about. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when there are a repetitive and persistent thought or obsession that is very distressing. That can be in the form of words or it can be in the form of images, but they're unwanted thoughts that are constantly kind of coming into the individual's mind. And as a result of those thoughts, there are compulsions that the individual is engaging in. So for example, the very classic example of OCD is a fear of germs or contamination, and then very frequent hand washing. And this isn't just hand washing 3 times a day, this is hand washing sometimes 100 times a day. So in all of these, as you can see, the key here is not just the presence of anxiety, but the level of impairment and what the individual is then avoiding, or how much time is being consumed with the worry or the subsequent behavior to deal with the worry.
And to clarify, with each of these disorders, this is through repeated occurrences.
Yes.
Associated with one another. Do you ever find that there are kids who look at this as like a rough night, and so they've got a panic attack one time, and then they've got obsessive compulsive disorder with one thing, so
yeah,
pulling from that?
There is huge overlap among these disorders, and in fact, in you know, these criteria were really developed and written for adult cases, and when we work with children and teenagers, oftentimes it's much more sort of a combination of a lot of symptoms, that it's not necessarily just one. We might see, like you're saying, some obsessive sort of rigidity around certain routines, a lot of worry, maybe a panic attack, so that we often see a lot of comorbidity between these disorders. Yeah?
When you talk about phobias, just talk about school phobia, but really it's really probably one of those specific things.
It might be, yeah. I mean, you know, it could be because of negative evaluation from others. It could be, you know, that they're afraid of having a panic attack. Oftentimes with school refusal cases that I've worked with, it's because kids have had a panic attack or have gotten sick in school, and then there's a pervasive fear about getting sick again or having a panic attack again. So it often does have elements, potentially, of a lot of these things, particularly social anxiety. Yeah, good question. And then just real quick, post-traumatic stress disorder, which also can lead to a lot of heightened anxiety, is when a child has witnessed, been part of, you know, somehow been involved in a very traumatic situation. This could be something like the loss of a parent, right? So there's a lot of different traumas that fit this criteria, but it's really when we're seeing the emotional distress following a really intense trauma that child has endured. Because so much of this criteria isn't always clearly applicable to kids, I know Kasaan and I both often find ourselves thinking more about this kind of unspecified or other specified anxiety, meaning that it doesn't really clearly fit exactly one of these criteria, but we're seeing elements of a lot of them. And we're really trying to assess what it is that is going on to best understand that individual's anxiety presentation. Yeah.
So as therapists, what, I mean, how are you able to hone in on, could it be this one, could it be that one?
Yeah.
You know, and if it is somewhat, excuse me, a little bit of this and a little bit of that,
yeah.
Do you turn to medication to help those things, or is it really just a therapy thing to help those types of disorders?
Yeah, we'll talk about treatments, but therapy, and particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, is the best treatment for anxiety. And we'll go into that. And the great thing is that it can be adaptable to lots of different anxiety symptoms. So it may not be, I mean, a lot of it is through assessment and talking with the parents, the student, the teachers, you know, observing what's going on to get a better handle on what's triggering the symptoms, what type of symptoms they are. But the great thing is that CBT is highly effective for all of these disorders. So the good thing is that we have a treatment that works, and we can kind of mold it and apply it depending on where we're seeing the symptoms. Okay. I just wanted to real quickly mention test anxiety, because there isn't a diagnosis, right, for test anxiety, but it is highly prevalent. Some studies put it at between 10 to 40%, right? That's a huge range, but depending on how they're looking at it, of students experience some type of test anxiety. And it can be so incredibly distressing that it can cause students to not finish an exam, right? Do poorly on an exam, not perform to their optimal ability. You know, I think the definition makes sense, right? We're really talking about any emotional, physical, or behavioral responses that are about and focused on the kind of consequences of an upcoming exam, whether it's fear of failing, how am I going to do on this, how am I going to focus. And we see that it really does differentially impact students that have learning disabilities or ADHD. There have been some interesting studies that females are more at risk for test anxiety. Now, females are more at risk in general for anxiety. There's just higher frequencies in females. But some of that, I think, and luckily we are progressing, I think, largely in this area. But, you know, a lot of times girls felt like they couldn't be good, right, or they weren't good at subjects like math, and so they were much more anxious going into math exams. I think our society has come a long way with that, but I think that also probably plays into why there is this research indicating higher levels of anxiety, because if you go into an exam feeling like you're not going to be good at it, it's going to heighten your anxiety level. And also minority students. So we do see that there is some interesting research on who is differentially affected, but in general, we know that there are high levels of this, particularly in you know, our kind of DC, rigorous, you know, highly academic environment. When a student perceives a threat in the test, whether it's that they're not going to do well, that they didn't study enough, that they're not smart enough, it's going to lead to lots of different thoughts, right? Negative predictions about how they're going to do, off-task behaviors, so fidgeting, being very, very focused on what other students are doing around them. I've had so many students I work with report to me that they get most anxious during an exam when the first student turns theirs in and they're not even anywhere close to finishing. And that just leads to a huge exacerbation of the anxiety. Even if, right, that student maybe didn't, you know, who knows how well they did or didn't do. And so that's part of what we begin to do in treatment, is really try to challenge some of those negative cognitions that are coming up, like, I must be failing, right, if that person is already done. And test anxiety can exacerbate and relate to a slower speed of completion. We often see those as really exacerbating one another. So if a student is already a little bit of a slower processor and they're anxious, those just feed one another, right? And again, it's that kind of chicken and egg problem, right? What comes first? But regardless, we know that they really influence one another. Just in the interest of time, there's a bunch of slides on this 3-component model. I'm just going to skip ahead to one with a lot of 3 components spelled out. Okay. When we think about anxiety, we really think about it as having 3 different components, 3 main components. That being, there are thoughts, anxious thoughts or worries. There are feelings, physiological and also emotional, that are occurring, and there's behaviors. So let's take the example of a student who is concerned that they're not going to do well on an exam. So the previous night they were studying, they began to worry that they really didn't know the material as well as they should. This is where that balance between stress and coping begins to get shifted, right? Because maybe their way of coping with the anxiety the night before was not really balancing out the stress and anxiety they were feeling. Maybe they procrastinated, maybe they really studied hard and are just really struggling with feeling confident about this exam. So you go into an exam and the thought is, I have to do well on this exam, but I'm feeling so nervous, I think my mind is going to go blank. Okay? That's going to lead to a lot of physiological responses. Maybe your heart rate's elevated as you're walking into that exam because you're feeling anxious. Maybe you're feeling sweaty. Maybe you're having trouble focusing. Those are going to feed one another, right? Because as I mentioned, if we're perceiving that our heart rate is increasing, many anxious kids are going to start saying, why is my heart beating so fast? I must be really anxious, right? And all of that is feeding into one another.
So that's an automatic response by your sympathetic nervous system.
Right.
If your brain feeds threat, then your body is just going to automatically respond and prepare you for threat.
Exactly. And then we've got all these behaviors, right? Maybe we're fidgeting, maybe we're constantly erasing answers and questioning how we responded or how we answered on that item. And then maybe it gets so bad that the student asks the teacher that says that they need to leave the classroom. I can't do this, right? I can't focus. I'm not feeling well, and they leave, right? That could be a very extreme behavior. But what you can see here is that this is really bidirectional, right? All of these components are feeding into one another. So what's really important about this when we think about treatment is that treatment needs to target all three of these components. It needs to target the thoughts, it needs to target the physiological sensations, and it needs to target the behaviors to develop more effective coping so that this vicious cycle doesn't continue to occur.
So we'll hold off on questions at this point so we can get through the rest in the interest of time. So one of my colleagues talked about avoidance as anxiety's frenemy. And I just stuck with that term. I love using that term for teens and kids because it makes sense. So when you're feeling anxious and you escape, you leave the situation, your anxiety goes down right away. You feel pretty good. So that means it's really reinforcing. It feels really good and it feels like a friend. But really it's an enemy because it's going to keep the anxiety in a cycle going and perpetuate the cycle. So here's just kind of a diagram of what happens when you're anxious and you avoid. So you have a high anxiety situation here. You escape or avoid and your anxiety goes right down. And then a lot of time what happens is that sends feedback to your brain, that was a dangerous situation. Make sure you remember that next time, and next time there's an exam, leave. So it's not something your child is aware of, but it's the fight or flight response, a biological response that when you leave a situation you perceive as a threat, that's then sending a signal that was a real threat, remember to stay away next time. So next time you go in that anxiety-provoking situation, your fear is even higher, or at least it's as high as it was. Then again, that feels so intolerable, you escape or avoid, and oof, your anxiety goes right back down again. So that's the cycle we want to break. So one of my favorite techniques to treating anxiety that I think is one of the most powerful tools for most people is exposure. This means when there is not a real threat or a real danger, that you stay in the situation and you don't escape or avoid it. So tolerating anxiety in the short term and experiencing that discomfort decreases anxiety in similar situations in the future. So if you stick in there with the exam, you learn, you're sending feedback to your brain, this is uncomfortable, it's very confusing. When you stay in, you're teaching your brain and your body, this actually isn't a real threat or a real danger. So here's another diagram. You start an exposure, your anxiety, this is the anxiety here. You're at peak panic, your anxiety is really, really, really high, but you stay in. Your anxiety is going to naturally come down. That is called habituation or anxiety coasting. And you don't really have to do a whole lot but stay in the situation, because your sympathetic nervous system is when you physiologically are firing in fight or flight mode and very uncomfortable. But your body is only biologically hardwired to experience that level of anxiety for a short amount of time. It's to get you quickly out of the situation. So when you stay in and there's no real threat, your anxiety will naturally go down because your parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. And it will just regulate your heart rate, regulate your blood pressure, and help you feel more comfortable. So you might start here for your first exposure. You experience higher peak of anxiety, goes down naturally. Second time, less anxiety is experienced, till you're down here where you can face a situation and not experience much anxiety at all. So the principles of exposure are, it's used when there's no real threat. So maybe if there's a kid with a lot of social fears and he really is being bullied, that's not where exposure is helpful, because that is a real threat. So it's when your anxiety gives you an urge to escape or avoid. It teaches that the stimulus, the thing you're afraid of, is not actually dangerous, and your anxiety will come down. The most important thing for people that experience anxiety to know is, if I face this situation, if I face the fear, I'm actually going to feel less anxious. My anxiety will come down. When they learn that, that's a really powerful lesson. Practice makes permanent. So in the guest lecture, they talked about mastery or competence. So a kid or teen becomes competent that I can actually face my fears. That's huge. The more you do it, the less anxious you'll be. And once you start to work with anxiety, you don't let the person, so you say, okay, as a parent, you're supporting your child, you see them with the homework, they're getting more and more anxious, and you say, okay, that was enough exposure, and you let them escape. You don't want to do that, because that's going to, again, send threat signals back. So the way to help support these teens and your kids is to look for signs of avoidance. So are they procrastinating? Are they forgetting assignments? Are they skipping school social events? Procrastination again. Perfectionism, so really even it looks like they're not escaping or avoiding by being perfectionistic, because they're really checking and rechecking their assignments, but they're avoiding the idea that they could make a mistake. So we see that as avoidance. Praise effort. So really highlight the importance of being very brave. That was challenging for you, and that was pretty brave that you faced that. You can determine rewards for accomplishing tasks. So we do believe in some extrinsic motivators. Because you're really asking them to do something that is very uncomfortable and very challenging to do. So some kids earn songs or maybe extra time on the internet, things like that. If your student is in a tutoring session, you can focus on completing the assignment in a tutoring session where they have support, versus learning concepts can help reduce avoidance. So with an anxious kid, it's more important that they learn to sit there and complete the assignment versus think about the concepts, which can kind of maintain the avoidance. And you can support them by giving them some one-on-one support, so helping support them until they learn that they can master their anxiety. I'll take one quick question. Yeah.
This is easy if you have a young child, but we're talking about a teenager. How do you get the teenager to continue to face their fear?
Sure.
You can only push them so much.
Sure. So we'll talk about more strategies, but when it comes to academics, they usually are much more open to not a parent working with them, because independence is so important, that it could be a tutor, an older peer, or most schools have like a resource center, so a different adult in terms of academics. But we'll talk about other strategies in more detail, but that's where the extrinsic motivators come in. So, getting more time out to hang with their friends. Sometimes they work towards really larger ticket items like a laptop that you might have to get anyway, but that they're going to earn that by points, things like that.
And usually earning independence, like having some sort of autonomy-based reinforcer, so you can, like, your curfew can be a little extended, or maybe you can go out with friends on a weeknight. Like, sometimes you can get more buy-in from teens with something that they're highly motivated or really want to engage in. Sometimes that's the key.
The biggest starter for me with teens is the education around the function of anxiety, because they don't know that if they stay in, their anxiety is going to come down, and that the more they face something, the more mastery or competence they're going to gain. So when I give them that education, they actually start, a lot of them sometimes just practicing this thing out on their own of, let me try approaching this fear or that fear. So you really have to educate them a lot that in the long term, this is what they're going to get. So a lot of times so you have to think about what's important to them. So you're going to freeze less on tests. You're going to be able to go to parties and feel less anxious. You'll be able to hang out with friends. So the end result, what is it that you get out of being less anxious, is something they're pretty motivated to have happen.
I know we're getting short on time, so I wanted, do you want to, should we give, I want to make sure we do mindfulness. Do you want to, do you want me to skip ahead a little bit?
Sure.
Or do you want to say anything about it?
Practice exams for test anxiety is a good one.
These are just some visuals of how to rate feelings, mostly for younger kids, because sometimes it's hard for them to identify it verbally. And here's an exposure example.
Sure, so quickly, this is an example around how to gradually help support your teen or your kid with facing a fear and how to do an exposure. So let's say you have a student who has creative writing and they're pretty afraid of failing, and they just are avoiding all of their English assignments. So first you just say, tell me a creative story. So this could be a tutor working with them, or if they're comfortable with working with you as a parent, but just tell me a story. So then you record it. So you want them to gradually, we think of this as a ladder, they want the difficulty to increase. So you don't want to start them off with the most difficult thing for them. So they can tell you a story, just tell me any story. Then have them reread the story as it's written down. So this is exposure, facing the actual feared situation. Then have them tell a creative story that's their actual assignment while you record it. Have them reread and edit that story. Then have them, you'll edit the story and give feedback. So give a little bit of kind of critique in a gentle way. And then have them actually write the story. That's an actual assignment. Give them a little bit of feedback. And then they'll bring it into the teacher. So you gradually help them build up towards the end goal. Sometimes I have parents say, I'm not going to have them just tell me a creative story. That's not what they need to do. But you want to shape them and let them not be too flooded and overwhelmed. So we like to, in the beginning, give them like maybe not full anxiety, not that their highest fear, but like moderate. So we kind of rate it out of 0 to 100, maybe start at about a 50.
We only have about 5 minutes, is that right? Timing-wise? Okay. Let me just skip. I wanted to, and these slides will be online, correct? So people can look through. Okay. I just wanted to skip ahead for a minute and talk about mindfulness, because this is another kind of hot topic and can be something incredibly useful to use with our teens and our students who are highly anxious or stressed. The idea with mindfulness is that we're really just trying to get grounded in the present moment. Because again, worry, right, is so focused on the past and the future, right? Things I did wrong or things I'm going to do wrong. And so trying to help them be a little bit more present with what they're doing in the moment. And there's some great ways we can do this. I'm just going to skip ahead. And it can be something as simple as stretching, right? Stretching your muscles, doing some deep breathing, doing what's called progressive muscle relaxation, which is just the idea of tensing and releasing your muscles. And there are thousands of resources online, scripts and different exercises that are just kind of short little practices that can be hugely beneficial to do, you know, before a test, before a really scary assignment where there's a lot of anxiety. It's pretty amazing to me when I do muscle relaxation with teenagers. Oftentimes they'll say to me, I didn't realize how tight I was in my shoulders until I was actually forced to tighten and relax and felt that difference. So these are just, again, some kind of simple ways of trying to help teens let go a little bit of that tension, whether it be behavioral or even cognitive worry. Sometimes listening to music can be hugely powerful too. Not just having music on in the background, really listening to it. Listening to the different instruments, listening to the words, listening to, you know, how the different sounds are coming together. We often don't, and particularly teens often don't, stop and pause. And so this can be hugely effective for helping, particularly with test anxiety, but just for being able to manage that moment when they're highly anxious. This might be something for a kid, like you mentioned, who freezes. Right, to just be able to be mindful in that moment, to do some deep breaths, can often be really effective for helping them get over that hump of of anxiety and sort of help them not avoid, right, or get out of the situation. Obviously, exposures that parents do or these mindfulness strategies can be really effective for some and not enough for other kids. And so these are just some thoughts about, you know, when anxiety is so impairing that kids are not functioning, that's a real indicator that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, might be really helpful for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, session 1 has now ended.
Let me
Please
just
move
show
to
you
session
guys,
2.
and I'm sorry we didn't get through all these slides, but there are some resources here. Please check them out. These are just some websites for different kind of big life stuff that leads to a lot of anxiety in teens. Some apps that students find very helpful for the management of anxiety and stress, as well as ADHD. And some different books, both for teens and young children, that parents can use to help kids manage anxiety from a more kind of self-help perspective. So we hope those are useful for you guys.
We have some brochures up here on the desk, as well as some flyers. We are leading an anxiety group for teens that we're really excited about, so there's some resources there.
And we both have business cards. If we didn't get to answer your question, I'm sorry we didn't have more of an open forum at the end for questions, but please come up to us and we can give you our contact information, and we're happy to answer questions via email or phone.